of tissues talking about connective tissues. And connective tissues, their big job is to connect things. But we've got 4 different classes that are going to have slightly different functions. The first class of connective tissue is what we call connective tissue proper. And in general, the function of connective tissue proper is to connect one tissue type to another. So it's connective tissue proper because it's doing the proper job of connecting one tissue type to another. The next class of connective tissue is cartilage. Cartilage is a supporting connective tissue. So we find it like between bones. We'll talk about all of our specific types of connective tissue proper and all of our types of cartilage. As far as identifying things in your lab, I think the only things that you have to identify today are connective tissue proper. We'll look at cartilage when we look at bone. So we'll look at bone tissue as well when we get to the skeleton. That's another type of connective tissue. Bone is actually connective tissue. And so this is going to help with protection and support. It's the only totally solid tissue in our body. And then the last type of connective tissue is also the only one of its kind. It's blood, and it's the only fluid tissue in our body. And its job is to transport things. So we'll look at different types of connective tissue proper. We'll talk about all of these other connective tissue types. We'll briefly touch on muscle and nervous tissue, but all of the specifics we'll go through when we get to the system. So cartilage and bone tissue you'll be identifying and recalling when we get to the skeletal system. Muscle tissue we'll talk about when we get to the muscular system. Nervous tissue we'll talk about at the end of the semester when we get to neurons, and then the nervous system. So those are our classes of connective tissues though. Connective tissue proper, which connects one tissue to another. Cartilage that helps provide support. Bone that helps with protection and support. And blood that's going to transport materials around the body. So an example of a type of connective tissue proper is we actually have 6 different subclasses that we'll look at. But this example that is showing here is what's called dense regular connective tissue. It's dense because our cells are tightly packed together, and it's regular because they've got an irregular arrangement. I wouldn't worry about taking a bunch of notes now because we're going to go over each type in a little bit. As far as cartilage goes, this is an example of cartilage, hyaline cartilage. This is the most abundant cartilage in the body, and you find it like it makes up your nose, it attaches your ribs to your sternum, things like that. Bone tissue, there are actually 2 types of bone. If you look at the skeletons out here, all you're seeing is compact bone, the first type. Spongy bone is deep to compact bone. Not in all of our bones as adults, but we'll talk more about that when we get to the skeletal system. And then blood is our fluid connective tissue, and it doesn't really have subclasses, and we'll talk more about that next semester. All right, so what are the functions of connective tissue? So it's going to help with connecting tissue to each other, so binding things together. It's going to help with protection, support, all this stuff. So we've kind of already addressed it when we went through the classes. Are there any questions on classes or general functions? Probably most of your questions will come up when we go through our specific types of connective tissue. Okay, so what are some characteristics that all of our connective tissues share in common? The first is that they all arise from this embryonic tissue called mesenchyme. So a mesenchyme is an embryonic tissue. So some people, when they look at other characteristics of connective tissue, say, well, why is blood a connective tissue? Well, it arises from mesenchyme. So it's all going to start from this mesenchymal embryonic tissue. Another characteristic that we could say of our connective tissues is that they all have varying degrees of vascularity. Vascularity is always referring to blood supply. So bone is highly vascularized. They are living organs that are continually undergoing molding and remodeling, so it has a lot of vasculature. It's also the site of blood cell production. That spongy bone that I said was deep to compact bone is where our blood cells are produced. So we've got to be able to get those to the blood, and we can't do that unless we have blood vessels. So blood is highly vascularized, but cartilage is almost avascular. So it's got very little blood supply. Tissue proper is connecting one tissue to another, epithelial tissues are on top, so we've got to be able to be connected, and they've got to get their blood supply, so they're getting it from connective tissue proper. Okay, so these are characteristics of connective tissue. These are all types of connective tissue. So connective tissue proper is pretty highly vascularized. All of these four are arising from mesenchyme. All of them have varying degrees of vascularity. Your blood doesn't really, it flows through blood vessels, so that one's kind of weird. It's in the blood vessels. So I don't know if you want to say it's super highly vascularized. It actually does serve the blood vessels passing through it, but we'll talk more about that next semester. So they're characteristics of all connective tissues, and they're going to be like varying degrees of this vascularity in each one of these. So bone and connective tissue proper are highly vascularized. They have their own blood vessels. Blood is kind of weird, but it flows through the blood vessels, and cartilage has almost no blood vessels. Characteristic is that in our connective tissues, our cells are producing and surrounding themselves in what's called extracellular matrix. So we'll say cells produce and surround themselves in extracellular matrix, which is abbreviated ECM. Extra because it's outside the cell, cellular because they're making it, and then matrix it's this weird stuff. It's got two parts. So our extracellular matrix is secreted by our cells. We'll talk about our specific cell types in a minute, and then we'll talk about the specific types of matrix when we get to the specific tissues. But in general, we need to understand what is extracellular matrix. It's this weird, non-living stuff that contains two things. What's called ground substance, and ground substance can vary from liquid, like blood plasma is the liquid extracellular matrix of blood, and then bone has solid extracellular matrix, so the ground substance is really, it's solid. So the ground substance is this material that fills the empty spaces between cells, or we'll say that fills spaces between cells, and changes depending on the tissue type. So we'll look at the specifics when we go through the specific tissues. The second part, so ground substance is one part of extracellular matrix. The second part of extracellular matrix are protein fibers. And there are three types of protein fibers that we find in varying proportions throughout our different connective tissues. So, again, our third characteristic of connective tissues is that our cells are producing and surrounding themselves in extracellular matrix. Extracellular matrix has two components. Ground substance, which is the material that's filling the space between cells, and it's going to change depending on which tissue type you're looking at. And then protein fibers are the second part of extracellular matrix. We've got three types that we have to worry about. Collagen fibers. And collagen protein is very strong. So these are the strongest of our protein fibers, and they are going to be able to give connective tissue the most stability and tensile strength. So they give tensile strength and stability. So the first type of protein fibers are collagen fibers. They're our strongest fibers, and they are going to be found in tissues where we need to have a lot of tensile strength. So that's our first thing about collagen fibers. They're also the most abundant type of connective tissue fibers. So that can be another thing to say about them. They're the most abundant. The next type of protein fiber that we have is what's called an elastic fiber. And these are made of the protein elastin. And elastin is this protein that's unique because it stretches and then can bounce back. We call that recoil. So elastic fibers have the ability to stretch and recoil. So this gives tissue stretch and recoil. So what would be an example of a place we need that? Well, the great vessels that are leaving our heart are under blood pressure, high blood pressure. When your heart contracts, it's putting all of this force on the blood, and they're going to put force on the blood vessels. So they have to stretch in response to that. But then they also have to bounce back, because when your heart relaxes, if they didn't bounce back, if they just stayed stretched, you'd lose your blood pressure. So they can stretch in response to ventricular contraction, and then bounce back when your ventricles relax. So we find these in places where we have to have the ability not only to stretch to resist tension, but then bounce back. So elastic proteins, or elastic protein fibers, are found in tissues where we have to have that characteristic. So we call that stretch and recoil. And then the last type of fibers are the most rare, and they're called reticular fibers. And they are made of the same stuff as collagen fibers, but it's arranged in a different way. So they're not nearly so strong. Instead, they're thin, and they tend to form like mesh networks in the tissues that you find them. So we can say they're made of same stuff as collagen fibers, which is collagen protein, but it's arranged in a different way that allows them to be like these, form mesh networks. So they're pretty thin and wispy. So these form, let's say they're kind of thin, and they tend to form mesh networks. Reticular fibers, we've got these organs, there's reticular connective tissue, we've got these organs, like your lymphatic organs, that are part of your immune system, like your lymphatic system, which is your immune system, and they're holding a bunch of cells. So, like your spleen is a storage site for red and white blood cells. So it's got a bunch of reticular tissue that forms like this network that all of the blood cells are hanging out in. So we'll look at that as we go through our specific types of connective tissue. All right, so let's talk about our different types of cells then. So when our cells start out and are secreting extracellular matrix, they're making it and producing it before they become fully entrapped in it. We call them blasts. So blasts are like the immature cells that are producing our extracellular matrix. They're going to turn into cytes. So our first type of blasts are what are called fibroblasts. And they're found in connective tissue proper. They don't really turn to fibrocytes. I've never seen them called fibrocytes. These continue to take on the name blasts. Other cells are going to change. The next are called chondroblasts. And these are found in cartilage. So our chondroblasts are found in cartilage. They become chondrocytes once cartilage has a really thick, viscous ground substance. It's almost solid. So once they entrap themselves in it, that little space is called a lacuna, and they'll become then a mature chondrocyte. So we'll say our chondroblasts are found in cartilage, and they become chondrocytes once they're entrapped in the lacuna. And we'll see those in just a minute. So this weird term lacuna, we'll look at in a minute, we'll see what that is. But this is space that these cells are getting trapped in after they've secreted their matrix.
So do fibroblasts more mature?
It's not that they don't mature, but we don't start calling them fibrocytes. I don't know why they, your book is giving this as like a base rule, blanket rules, but fibroblasts are pretty much always fibroblasts. Our other cell types are going to change. Do you have a question?
What's that word become what?
They become chondrocytes once they are entrapped in a lacuna.
So did the fibroblasts change like other chondrocytes do when they're maturing? Or do
They just stop. So after you're done producing and secreting heavy amounts of extracellular fluid, when you're mature, you just maintain it. So they just sit there and maintain it. The last type of blast that we have is what's called an osteoblast. And osteoblasts lay down solid bone matrix. So they're found in bone. And again, these are going to become osteocytes once they entrap themselves in a lacuna. It's a space in this solid tissue that's holding the cell. So then the cell reaches out through the lacuna and maintains the matrix afterwards. We'll see a picture of it in a second. Then the last type of cell that we have that gives rise to other cells that we find in blood is what's called a hematopoietic stem cell. And so the immature blood cells all start as these hematopoietic stem cells, and then they can follow different differentiating pathways to become red blood cells or white blood cells or the cells that are going to give rise to platelets. So we will talk about that next semester when we talk about blood. So we'll say these are going to become blood cells. Resident cells of our various connective tissues. There are a couple other cells that we can find in different types of connective tissues. So, but they're not going to be producing and secreting the extracellular matrix. They are just going to be hanging out in the connective tissues. So we've got these other cells that we find in our one of our types of loose connective tissue propers. Adipose tissue, which is fat tissue, has these cells called the Diplocytes. So this is found in adipose tissue. And these cells are unique because they accumulate large fat droplets. Their job is to store fat. And we can use fat as an energy store, and it also helps to insulate our body. So they're found in adipose tissue, and they accumulate fat. Red blood cells are the main types of cells in blood, but we also have white blood cells. So those are another type that we find in blood. We'll talk more about blood next semester. Another type of cell that you can find hanging out in cartilage and things are these cells called mast cells. Mast cells start an inflammatory response. So because cartilage doesn't have a really high blood supply, if cartilage becomes damaged, it can be hard to fix it. So, but if we start an inflammatory response in the cartilage, we can bring more cells to the area to try and help fix it. So these cells called mast cells are resident cells that live in cartilage, and if there's injury, they can start an inflammatory response. So we'll say they start an inflammatory response. And this will just help get blood and nutrients to the area so that we can try and fix whatever damage is going on.
So is this still loose connective tissue?
This is still just connective cells. These are the resident cells that are making the extracellular matrix. These are other cells that you find throughout connective tissue. And then our last type of cell that you find floating around in connective tissues are what are called macrophages. Macro means big, phage means eat. So these are our big eaters. They gobble up anything foreign. So they are phagocytic for anything foreign. So they're going to provide connective tissues with some immunity. So again, these cells in green are all of our resident cells that are hanging out and making our extracellular matrix. These cells in purple are just other cells that we can find in connective tissues. Adipocytes are going to be found in only two types of connective tissues. We can find mast cells throughout different types of connective tissues and macrophages as well, because they're providing some protection for those tissues. So let's look at our types of connective tissue proper. First, we'll start with loose. So we've got two types of general categories of connective tissue proper: loose connective tissues and dense connective tissues. Our loose connective tissues, the arrangement of the fibers is kind of all over the place and it's loose. They're not tightly packed. So our first type of loose connective tissue proper is areolar connective tissue. And areolar connective tissue is pretty abundant. It underlies our epithelial tissues, and it's going to help to provide the blood supply that those epithelial tissues need. So we can find it widely distributed under epithelial tissues. For example, it forms what's called the lamina propria of our mucous membranes. We'll see that our mucous membranes have an upper epithelial layer that you have to be able to identify, and then they've got this areolar connective tissue layer under it called the lamina propria. These also are going to package our organs and surround capillaries, so they're really helping to provide cushioning and support. So the main cells there are fibroblasts. So we could say our fibroblasts are secreting this semi-viscous, not horribly hard ground substance that contains all three tissue types. So the fibroblasts are the resident cells. Secrete, we'll say, semi-viscous ground substance that has all three tissue types. Or sorry, all three fiber types. So it's got collagen fibers, it's got elastin fibers, and it has reticular fibers. Why does it need all of this? Because it is functioning to support and cushion your organs. It's also found under your epithelial lining, so it's got the vasculature that's serving that overlying epithelial tissue. So we'll say it contains blood vessels that support epithelial tissue. And its big job is to provide cushioning and support. So we have some good areolar slides that look just like this. So what you'll see is you've got fibroblasts, and you can see their nuclei, and then these empty spaces are not empty, they're full of ground substance. And then our collagen fibers are the thick pink fibers. Our next thickest fibers are our elastic fibers. And let's see, I don't really see, some of these like wispy areas back here are probably reticular fibers. Reticular fibers are pretty hard to see under the scope unless you're looking at reticular connective tissue, where we've got a lot of them. Any questions about areolar connective tissue?
The three fiber types for the collagen, the elastic, and what?
And reticular. All right, are we good on that? Our next type of loose connective tissue proper is adipose tissue. Our adipose tissue, again, has this high concentration of adipocytes. It does have some areolar connective tissue ground substance. So some of our slides have more areolar tissue than they have in other slides. So it can kind of look like this weird mix of areolar and adipose tissue. And that's because our adipose tissue has areolar ground substance, or I should say areolar matrix. But it's mostly adipocytes. So we'll say with a high number, that is like a high number of adipocytes. And the function of adipose tissue is it acts as an energy store, and it insulates so that we don't have rapid gains or loss of heat. Adipose tissue is pretty easy to recognize because fat doesn't take up dye. So these big fat droplets look clear, but you can see the plasma membranes of the cell, and then the nucleus gets squashed to the side. So this is a big fat droplet that's squishing the nucleus to the side of the cells. So I think it's really easy to identify adipose tissue because it looks like a lot of big open spaces. They're not open spaces, they're full of fat. The fat's just not picking up dye. So where do we find this? There's a layer under your skin called subcutaneous tissue, or your hypodermis, and it's a large proportion of adipose tissue. Adipose tissue is an example of a tissue that's amitotic. So after about 2 years old, you have all the adipocytes you'll ever make unless you're morbidly obese. So the number that you have at 2 is the number that you have forever. So what happens is they just get bigger and bigger and bigger, or yeah, you can burn off that fat and they shrink, but the only time you would see an increase in number, there is this condition called morbid obesity. And what happens in morbid obesity, they just get so big that they start exploding. And you're really not far from death. That's why it's called morbid obesity. When your fat cells start exploding, you could say in that case you're increasing in number, but it's not because of mitosis. Our last type of loose connective tissue is reticular connective tissue. And reticular connective tissue has a high proportion of reticular fibers. And we don't find it in very many places around the body. It forms what's called the stroma, or like this soft skeleton for lymphatic organs. Lymphatic organs are the organs that have large supplies of white blood cells and help with immunity. We'll see that next semester. Your spleen has large supplies of red and white blood cells. This is your blood cell storage area. And so its whole framework is based on reticular fibers. So it's a very loose network of our reticular fibers. They've got this gel-like ground substance. They've got a lot of reticular fibers, and then all of our blood cells are going to just kind of sit on that. So for our reticular connective tissue, it forms this mesh-like stroma, which is forming the support of our lymphatic organs. And it's fibroblasts that are secreting that. So for reticular tissue, we'll say our fibroblasts secrete a gel-like ground substance that is rich in reticular fibers. This is going to form a mesh network called the stroma, which is like the skeleton for our lymphatic organs. So other than your spleen, other lymphatic organs would be like your lymph nodes. Lymph nodes have high supplies of white blood cells. Your spleen has red and white blood cells, but your lymph nodes are just white blood cells. Your bone marrow is making both types of blood cells, so it's also got reticular fibers. But it's loose. All of these tissues are loose because the ground substance and the fibers are arranged in kind of this loose fashion, as opposed to our dense connective tissues, where our fibers are packed together. So are there any questions on loose connective tissues before we move on? All right. So the next type of connective tissue proper that we have are what are called dense connective tissues. And dense connective tissues have really tightly packed fibers, and they tend to be squishing their fibroblasts in between them. So our first type of dense connective tissue proper is what's called dense regular connective tissue. And in dense regular connective tissue, it gets that name because we have this regular arrangement of our collagen fibers. So we have fibroblasts that get squished between these collagen fibers, and our fibroblasts are secreting a very viscous but pretty sparse ground substance that has a ton of collagen fibers that are arranged parallel to each other. So for dense regular, we could say fibroblasts secrete sparse, very viscous ground substance, rich in collagen fibers that are arranged parallel to each other. So there's this nice regular arrangement of our collagen fibers. This would be our viscous ground substance, and then our fibroblasts get squished between them. And our dense regular connective tissue is specially suited to absorb shock or absorb tension in one direction. So it is going to absorb shock or absorb shock or tension in one direction. We find dense regular connective tissue making our tendons, our ligaments, and these things called aponeuroses. So tendons are the structures that attach muscle to bone. Ligaments are the structures that attach bone to bone. Aponeuroses are these weird things that attach muscle to muscle across a bone. So we'll say these attach muscle to muscle across a bone. You've got this muscle on your head called the epicranius, and it's got a frontal belly and an occipital belly, and they're attached by the epicranial aponeurosis that goes across your skull. So on these models in the back, you can see an aponeurosis. So I'm pointing at this guy back here. That's the frontal belly of the epicranius. That white thing there, above it, is an aponeurosis. So it's like a sheath that it goes across the bone. And in the back, we would see another belly of the occipital belly of that muscle. So crinkling your eyebrows, if you can move your ears, you're moving all these muscles that are attached to that. So an aponeurosis is going to attach muscle to muscle across the bone. How you can remember which attaches which, like the difference between tendons and ligaments. What helped me is that ligaments attach bone straight to bone. So that's a pretty straight line there, bone to bone. Tendons attach bone to muscle. So I don't know if that helped you at all, but it helped me to see that it's like it's not the same tissue type, so it's not this straight attachment, and you get that by having not a straight T. So I don't know if that helped you at all, but it helped me. Tendons and ligaments can kind of throw people off sometimes. So any questions about dense regular connective tissue? Our next type of dense connective tissue is dense irregular connective tissue. And it's called dense irregular connective tissue because it's got an irregular arrangement of the collagen fibers. So we again have fibroblasts that are secreting a viscous brown substance, and they're primarily making collagen fibers, but the collagen fibers are arranged all irregularly. And what that does is allows dense irregular connective tissue to absorb tension or shock or stretch from multiple directions. So we'll say for dense irregular, our fibroblasts are secreting a viscous brown substance rich in collagen fibers that are arranged irregularly. This is going to allow this tissue to resist stretch in multiple directions. So where do we find it? It makes up the dermis of your skin. So your skin is attached to our dense irregular connective tissue. The top layer, your epidermis, is epithelial. Your bottom layer, the dermis, is dense irregular. So the whole tissue can resist stretch in many directions because it's got dense irregular connective tissue under it. So the function is really going to help with resisting stretch in many directions. So it also contains elastic fibers, but it's primarily collagen fibers. So I guess I should say that there are also some elastic fibers, because that's what's going to help us resist this stretch. But they're primarily collagen fibers. And so it's going to be able to resist stretch in many directions. We find it in the dermis of your skin. It also helps form what are called fibrous capsules around organs or joints. And then this layer of your digestive tract called the submucosa. So we'll meet the submucosa next semester. We'll talk about the dermis next week. We'll talk about our fibrous capsules of joints when we get to the skeletal system. But the outer layer of a lot of your organs has this tissue as well. It's like the fibrous capsule that holds the organ together and keeps it in shape. Last type of dense connective tissue proper is elastic connective tissue. And this has fibroblasts that are secreting a viscous brown substance that's really rich in elastic fibers. And this is going to be what we find making up the walls of our large arteries that have to be able to resist that blood pressure. You can also find it in some ligaments in your vertebral column and then in walls of your bronchial tube. So our last type of dense connective tissue is elastic. And we could say that our fibroblasts are secreting a viscous brown substance that's rich in elastic fibers, and that this tissue is going to have the ability to stretch and recoil. That's its big function. So you find it in the great vessels leaving your heart. You can find it in the walls of your bronchial tubes. 3 types: dense regular, where we've got this regular arrangement of collagen fibers; dense irregular, where we've got this irregular arrangement; and elastic. We've got 3 types of cartilage. We'll look at cartilage under the scope when we get to the skeletal system, but we should talk about it now because it is a connective tissue and you need to know it. So there are 3 different types of cartilage. The first is called hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is the most abundant, and so its chondrocytes are secreting a very viscous ground substance. So they start as chondroblasts and produce that ground substance. Once they've surrounded themselves and totally become entrapped in this space, we call it a chondrocyte, and this is a lacuna. So this is like a space within the solid ground, the solid extracellular matrix that's holding the mature cell. Yes?
What does viscous mean?
Thick.
Thick.
Yep. So for hyaline cartilage, it's our most abundant cartilage, and we find it actually forms the mold of the embryonic skeleton, so we'll talk about that when we get to bones. But it also covers bones in a joint, so that instead of having hard bone tissue rubbing up against each other, you've got smooth hyaline cartilage rubbing up against each other. It forms what are called our costal cartilages. All of these cartilages right here that attach our ribs to the sternum, those are all hyaline cartilage. Your nose is hyaline cartilage. The parts of your trachea and your larynx are hyaline cartilage. So hyaline cartilage is the most abundant cartilage in the body. And what we could say is that the chondroblasts secrete a viscous ground substance I'm going to abbreviate ground substance as GS, that's rich in collagen fibers, and then they entrap themselves in the lacuna to become chondrocytes. So they become chondrocytes in the lacuna, which is just this like space that's holding them. After they're chondrocytes, their job is just to maintain the matrix. So they're making this really strong matrix that is helping to make this strong cartilage. The function is to help with support and reinforcement. It also acts as kind of a cushion against compressive stress. So its function is to provide support, and we'll say it supports and cushions.
What's the GS again?
Ground substance. Instead of writing out ground substance every time, I'm just going to start abbreviating it GS. So hyaline cartilage is the most abundant cartilage. Find it making up your nose, has your costal cartilages. We find it covering the ends of long bones and joints. Our next type of cartilage is elastic cartilage. Elastic cartilage has a high proportion of elastic fibers, so its matrix is similar to hyaline cartilage, but it's got a higher proportion of elastic fibers. And what this does is allow the tissue that it's in to maintain its shape while it's still able to be really flexible. So a great example of where we have elastic cartilage is making up your outer ear. So you could sleep on your ear all night like this, and when you wake up in the morning, it'll bounce back. It bounces back because it's got elastic cartilage. The other place that you find it is what's called your epiglottis. Your epiglottis is what covers your larynx when you're swallowing, so it also has to be able to have flexibility and bounce back. So for elastic cartilage, we'll say that our chondroblasts secrete a ground substance similar to hyaline cartilage, but rich in elastic fibers. And what this is going to do is it's going to give tissues, or it's going to give organs flexibility, but structure. So again, elastic cartilage has chondroblasts that secrete ground substance similar to hyaline cartilage, but rich in elastic fibers. They will also entrap themselves in a lacuna and become a chondrocyte. So this is true for all of our cartilages. That after they're done secreting their ground substance, they're going to trap themselves in a lacuna and be called chondrocytes. So that's true for elastic cartilage as well. We find this in organs that need flexibility but have to maintain their structure, like your outer ear or your epiglottis. All right, our last type of cartilage is what's called fibrocartilage. Fibrocartilage also has a matrix that's similar to hyaline cartilage, but it's got a lot of thick collagen fibers that are arranged parallel, and what it's going to do is it's really going to be a great shock absorber. So it is very good at absorbing compressive shock. So this is fibrocartilage, and it's got a matrix similar to hyaline, but has a high proportion of collagen fibers that are arranged regularly, or we'll say arranged parallel to each other. And what this is going to do is allow this to be a great shock absorber. So fibrocartilage is a great shock absorber. It resists compressive stress. And if we look at where we find it, it makes sense. We find it in our intervertebral discs. So in between all of your vertebrae, you've got pads of fibrocartilage that are going to be able to resist compressive shock. So as you're bouncing around and whatever, your vertebrae are bouncing on each other, that compression is being resisted by these pads of fibrocartilage. So that's one place you find them. When they say you slip a disc, what you're doing is one of these fibrocartilage pads is slipping out and pinching your spinal cord. So that's one place we find it. You also find it here, this region called your pubic symphysis. And then you find it in your knee joint. It makes these pads called meniscus. And that also, this joint, this knee joint, is continually experiencing compressive pressure. So compressive shock. It locks and it holds you in place. If you're standing for 8 hours, then all of that pressure is being resisted by a pad of fibrocartilage. All right, so that's connective tissue proper. And our cartilages. Cartilages are supporting tissue. Bone, again, we're going to talk about in great detail when we get to the skeletal system. But in our last couple minutes, I do want to just cover briefly our last tissue types, because that's how we're going to wrap up chapter 4. So bone is our only solid tissue. And we've got two types. Everything that you're looking at here is what we call compact bone. That's also what this micrograph is. So the outside of all your long bones, the outside of all your bones is compact bone. And what you can see is that our osteocytes get trapped in these lacuna. So these dark circles here are osteocytes that are entrapped in a lacuna. And so we find compact bone on the outside of all of our bones, and bone tissue has spongy bone that's deep to that. So we'll talk about that when we get to the skeletal system. We'll look at both different types of bone. Our last connective tissue type is blood. It's our fluid connective tissue. It has red and white blood cells. Red blood cells transport oxygen. White blood cells provide immunity. We'll talk about this next semester. We have a whole chapter on blood. But blood's unique because it's got a fluid matrix, the blood plasma that carries it around. I'm not going to ask these questions right now because we only have 5 minutes left. And we have muscle tissue. We've got 3 types of muscle tissue. Skeletal muscle we'll talk about this semester. Skeletal muscle attaches to bones and contracts to pull on them to cause movement. It's striated, we say. It's got this banding pattern, and that's due to the overlapping of contractile proteins that we'll talk about when we get to skeletal muscle. But some key words that we would say for skeletal muscle is that it's voluntary, it's striated, and it's multinucleate. So your skeletal muscle cells are called fibers, and they're as long as the muscle they reside in. So they can be very long cells. And what happens during embryonic development is you get several little muscle cells called myoblasts that fuse together. That's why it has many nuclei, because lots of little individual cells fuse together to form this big long fiber. And we'll talk more about that when we get to muscular system. The other type of muscle tissue that we have is cardiac muscle tissue. We'll talk about this next semester when we talk about the heart, but it is a tissue, so we're talking about it now. The key word we would use for this is that it's also striated. but it's involuntary. You don't have voluntary control over cardiac muscle. These cells are fibers, but they're branched, and they're joined by these specialized junctions called intercalated discs. These are both desmosomes and gap junctions. The desmosomes hold the cells together physically, and the gap junctions hold the cells together chemically, so that all of our cardiocytes contract at once. So that way we have efficient pumping of blood. They can have 1 to 2 nuclei. The last type of muscle is what's called smooth muscle. Its key word would be smooth, and also involuntary. Each cell only has 1 nucleus, and their cells they call spindle-shaped. So their contractile proteins are kind of swirl all around them, and you can find them throughout our hollow organs, pushing things through the hollow organs. The last type of tissue we have is nervous tissue. We'll talk about this at the end of the semester. There are 2 categories of cells: the communicating cells that are doing the work of the nervous system, which are our neurons. So they are responding to signals and sending signals. And then there are supporting cells called glial cells. But again, we'll talk about all of those in great detail at the end of the semester.